Sir, I said take a seat. Diane Johnson didn't know she just ordered a man who'd killed 3 people that year to wait his turn. She didn't know his mother was clutching his arm, whispering in Korean that this woman was different, special, and dangerous in her own way. All Diane knew was that the man in the $10,000 suit was glaring at her like she'd committed a crime, and she just made either the smartest or stupidest decision of her life. Koo Jae-hwan sat, his presence turning the bank's air into ice. For a man who had traded his soul for a throne of blood after his father's assassination, Diane's defiance felt like a sudden, agonizing spark of life. He watched her, not with the predatory gaze of a boss, but with the hollow hunger of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as human. To Diane, he was a stubborn customer. To the world, he was a monster. But as their eyes locked, the ache in Jae-hwan's chest deepened. He realized that to love her would be to mark her for death, yet to walk away would be to die inside. Diane was no longer just a teller. She was the most dangerous thing in his world, a reason to stay alive. The choice between love and survival is never easy. If you're ready to see how far Jae-hwan will go to protect her, subscribe now so you don't miss Chapter 2. We have readers joining this journey from all over. Where in the world are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. Diane Johnson adjusted her glasses, the fluorescent banklights reflecting off the plexiglass barrier that felt far too thin for the shadow currently looming over her station. Koo Jae-hwan did not move like a man subject to the laws of banking or gravity. He moved like a predator accustomed to the sudden silence of a room. Diane felt the phantom heat of her mother's voice in her head, a woman who had nursed the dying and feared no living soul, warning her that some men were built of nothing but teeth and old scars. Koo Jae-hwan reached for the velvet rope, his eyes like polished obsidian, expecting the Red Sea of commonality to part for his custom-tailored presence. Diane didn't blink, her fingers hovering over the next guest button as she met his lethal gaze with a spine made of ironwood. Sir, I said take a seat, Diane Johnson repeated, her voice a cool, rhythmic strike that didn't vibrate with a single tremor of fear. Koo Jae-hwan froze, his knuckles whitening as they gripped the velvet divider, a physical manifestation of the violence he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. In the silent war of the South Side, men had died for less than a command, and the air in the lobby curdled with the sudden, metallic taste of impending conflict. Koo Jae-hwan's neck tattoo, a dark, intricate dragon, seemed to pulse against his collar as he processed the impossibility of a woman in a polyester vest standing her ground. For the first time since his father's throat was opened in a dark soul alleyway, Koo Jae-hwan found himself paralyzed by a power that didn't come from a gun. Mangy broke the deadlock, her frail hand closing over Koo Jae-hwan's wrist with a grip that spoke of decades of survival. Mangy didn't look at her son. She studied Diane Johnson, her sharp eyes cataloging the steady rise and fall of the teller's chest and the lack of sweat on Diane's brow. Mangy whispered in Korean, a low, melodic rasp that cut through Koo Jae-hwan's mounting fury, "She is not afraid of your ghost, Jae-hwan. She is the fire that burns the shadows away." Koo Jae-hwan felt the heat of his mother's words bypass his anger and strike the hollow ache where his conscience used to reside. He had walked into this bank to move blood money, but he was suddenly aware that he was the one being weighed and found wanting. Koo Jae-hwan finally retreated, the heavy soles of his Italian leather shoes thudding against the marble as he sat in a low-rent plastic chair. Diane Johnson immediately turned her attention to a stack of deposit slips, treating the King of Chicago as if he were a ghost haunting a suburban branch. To Koo Jae-hwan, the indifference was a serrated blade. She didn't see the $10,000 suit or the blood on his hands, only a man who couldn't follow a simple instruction. Mangy leaned into her son's ear, her voice a final, haunting hook that snagged on his heart. She has kind eyes, Jae-hwan, the kind that see exactly what you've tried so hard to hide. Diane Johnson signaled the next guest with a curt nod, her pulse steady even as the air grew heavy with Koo Jae-hwan's return to her window. Koo Jae-hwan slid a thick, nondescript envelope across the marble counter, his movements calculated and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of Mangy hovering at his shoulder. Diane Johnson opened the flap, her eyes scanning the stacks of high-denomination bills that carried the faint, metallic scent of street-level power and deep vault storage. Most tellers would have stuttered or sought the safety of a manager at the sight of $250,000 in cash, but Diane Johnson simply reached for her counting machine. Koo Jae-hwan watched her fingers move with surgical precision, waiting for the flicker of greed or fear that usually greeted his wealth, but Diane Johnson remained an unreadable fortress. "Is there a problem with a legal tender, Ms. Johnson?" Koo Jae-hwan's voice was a low silk rasp, designed to probe for a weakness in her professional armor. Diane Johnson didn't look up from the rhythmic snap of the bills, her voice flat and unyielding as she countered his strike. "Money doesn't have a personality, Mr. Koo. It only has a total." Koo Jae-hwan felt the weight of that statement pull at the scar tissue in his memory, reminding him of a time before his father's death when numbers were just math, not blood-soaked obligations. He realized Diane Johnson wasn't ignoring his power. She was refusing to acknowledge its right to exist in her world. As the machine finalized the count at exactly $250,000, Koo Jae-hwan saw not a bank employee, but a woman who possessed the one thing he couldn't buy, an unbreakable center. Manji leaned forward, her eyes twinkling with a terrifying clarity that bypassed the transaction entirely. "My son spends his life surrounded by people who worship his shadow, Diane Johnson," Manji said, her English accented but sharp as a needle. "You are the first person to look at him and see only a man who needs a proper meal." Koo Jae-hwan stiffened, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek, yet he didn't silence his mother. Manji's hand swept toward her son in a gesture of silver-haired defiance, challenging Diane Johnson to step into the storm. "He is taking me to dinner tomorrow at the Seoul Orchid." A third chair would keep the conversation from becoming a business meeting. Diane Johnson felt the trap snap shut, the reckless honesty that had defined her South Side upbringing surging to the surface. She reached into her drawer, pulling out a crisp business card, her pen scratching 7 digits onto the back with a defiant, ink-stained finality. Diane Johnson slid the card toward Koo Jae-hwan, her knuckles grazing his for a fraction of a second, sending a jolt of unwanted electricity through her arm. "Call me after 5, Mr. Koo, if you're prepared to talk about something other than your balance sheet." Koo Jae-hwan's fingers closed over the card as if it were a rare, fragile lung, his obsession taking root in the heat of her touch. He turned to leave, but as the glass doors hissed open, a black sedan with tinted windows began a slow, predatory crawl toward the bank entrance. The bell above the door of Brood Awakening chimed with a piercing clarity that made Koo Jae-hwan's shoulders lock into a defensive ridge. Diane Johnson watched from the small corner table as Koo Jae-hwan entered, his eyes performing a tactical sweep of the room, checking the emergency exit, the kitchen service door, and the reflection in the espresso machine, before he even acknowledged her presence. Koo Jae-hwan chose the chair facing the entrance, his back to the wall, a posture carved from years of dodging the same lead-heavy fate that had claimed his father. Diane Johnson didn't offer a greeting. She simply pushed a steaming cup of black coffee toward him, noting the way Koo Jae-hwan's hand hovered instinctively near his jacket's inner lining. The steam curled between them like a ghost, a reminder that outside this sanctuary, a black sedan was likely circling the block with predatory intent. "Do you always treat a double espresso like a hostage negotiation, Mr. Koo?" Diane Johnson's voice was a soft probe, designed to puncture the suffocating stillness of his guard. Koo Jae-hwan didn't smile, his gaze shifting back to the glass storefront as a pedestrian slowed down outside. "In my world, Diane Johnson, the moment you stop looking at the door is the moment they carry you through it," Koo Jae-hwan replied, the bitterness of his coffee matching the gravel in his tone. Diane Johnson leaned forward, her elbows on the scarred wood, her proximity forcing Koo Jae-hwan to choose between his external surveillance and the woman challenging his reality. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that felt like a dared strike. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you were looking for a place to hide your latest shipment of laundered millions." Koo Jae-hwan's eyes snapped to Diane Johnson's, the air between them suddenly devoid of oxygen as the joke hit the jagged edge of his truth. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight, the kind that preceded a gunshot or a confession in the dark alleys of Koo Jae-hwan's memory. "My business is import-export, Diane Johnson, and it is a world of brutal regulations where a single mistake results in an erased bloodline," Koo Jae-hwan stated, his voice dropping to a frequency that made the coffee in Diane Johnson's cup ripple. The subversion was instant. Diane Johnson expected a denial, but Koo Jae-hwan gave her a glimpse of the jagged glass he walked on every day to keep Manji safe. He was shielding Diane Johnson from the specifics of the violence, but the raw honesty of his admission revealed a man who was drowning in his own protection. Diane Johnson felt the stinging heat of realization prickle her skin, the sixth sense that served her at the bank now screaming that Koo Jae-hwan was a beautiful, gilded trap. She saw the white-knuckle grip he maintained on his cup, a man holding on to his humanity with everything he had left. "You think you're a shield, Koo Jae-hwan, but shields are designed to be hit," Diane Johnson countered, her voice finally cracking with the weight of an attraction she couldn't rationalize. Koo Jae-hwan reached across the table, his fingers grazing hers with a desperate, scorched-earth urgency that signaled his complete loss of control. He opened his mouth to warn her away, but the sudden screech of tires on the wet pavement outside cut him off, leaving the door of Brood Awakening vibrating on its hinges. The screech of tires outside Brood Awakening was merely the overture to the heavy, suffocating silence of Auntie Kim's back room in Koreatown. Koo Jae-hwan sat across from Diane Johnson, the steam from a bowl of spicy soft tofu stew rising between them like the smoke of a guttering peace offering. Diane Johnson watched the way Ku Jae-hwan's eyes never stopped tracking the shadow of the waiter behind the rice paper screen, his vigilance a frantic, unhealed scar from a night 20 years ago. Ku Jae-hwan didn't reach for his chopsticks. Instead, he rested his hands flat on the table, his knuckles pale and ridged with the tension of a man waiting for the floor to fall out. The air in the cramped room tasted of sesame oil and the cold, metallic tang of a secret that had finally rotted through its packaging. "My father died over meal just like this, Diane Johnson," Ku Jae-hwan said, his voice a jagged rasp that seemed to catch on the ghosts in the room. Ku Jae-hwan described the spray of glass, the sudden weight of a collapsing body, and the way the world turned from color to a permanent, sunless gray before he was even old enough to shave. He admitted that the import-export business was a throne built on the wreckage of his own capacity for mercy, a necessity born of the day he realized kindness was just a target painted on his mother's back. Ku Jae-hwan looked at Diane Johnson with a hollow desperation, waiting for the disgust to settle on her face, but Diane Johnson only leaned closer into the heat of his confession. She saw not the monster of Chicago's headlines, but a boy who had been forced to become a beast to keep his family from the slaughter. "You use your power to make examples of people because you're terrified that if you stop, Mangy is the next victim," Diane Johnson countered, her voice a low, steady strike that stripped away his last defense. Ku Jae-hwan flinched as if she'd used a physical blade, his silence confirming that every execution and every threat was a frantic prayer to a god of violence for one more day of safety. He admitted that his hands would never be clean, that he had traded the ordinary life for a crown of thorns to ensure Mangy never had to taste the copper of her own blood again. Diane Johnson felt a stinging ache in her chest, a recognition of a man who had sacrificed his soul for a love that was also his greatest weakness. She reached across the table, not to comfort him, but to pin him to the truth with a gaze that refused to blink. "If I am to sit at this table, Ku Jae-hwan, I will not be fed table scraps of the truth," Diane Johnson declared, her voice cracking but unyielding. She demanded a promise of absolute transparency, a pact that would strip him of his secrets and leave him vulnerable for the first time in 2 decades. Ku Jae-hwan's jaw tightened, the dragon tattoo on his neck appearing to coil in the dim light, but he slowly nodded, a silent surrender to a woman who demanded more than his money. He paid the bill with a stack of bills that felt heavier than before, leading Diane Johnson out into the crisp, biting night air of the alley. As Ku Jae-hwan reached for the car door, Diane Johnson's sixth sense spiked, her eyes catching the dull, predatory glint of a black sedan idling 3 blocks away. The engine's low growl was a promise that the truth wouldn't be the only thing hunting them. The black sedan from Koreatown had haunted Diane Johnson's rearview mirror for 21 days, a silent, predatory reminder that safety was a luxury she could no longer afford. For 3 weeks, Diane Johnson had practiced the smart discipline of silence, ignoring the ghost of Ku Jae-hwan's touch and the hollow ache of his confession. But at 1 a.m., the sterile quiet of her apartment became a vacuum, pulling the air from her lungs until only the glowing screen of her phone offered a lifeline. Diane Johnson stared at the 7 digits she had scratched onto a business card, her thumb trembling over the dial icon as she realized that logic was a weak defense against a heart already compromised. The call connected on the first vibration, the silence on the other end heavy with a mutual, agonizing recognition of the cliff they were both standing on. "I'm choosing to be stupid tonight, Ku Jae-hwan," Diane Johnson whispered, her voice cracking against the receiver like dry tinder. Ku Jae-hwan didn't ask for an explanation or an apology. The only sound was the sharp, jagged intake of his breath and the immediate growl of a high-performance engine turning over in the distance. Diane Johnson stood by her window, watching the street lamps flicker, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the windowsill, waiting for the storm she had just summoned. 15 minutes later, the screech of tires echoed through the South Side alley, and the heavy thud of a car door announced that the King of Chicago had abandoned his throne to answer a bank teller's call. When Diane Johnson swung the door open, Ku Jae-hwan stood there, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot, looking less like a boss and more like a man who had been starving in a desert of his own making. "I have been going insane in the silence, Diane Johnson," Ku Jae-hwan rasped, stepping into her space until the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain overwhelmed her senses. He admitted that for 3 weeks he had patrolled the perimeter of her life like a ghost, guarding a door he wasn't allowed to enter, haunted by the fear that his darkness had finally extinguished her light. Diane Johnson didn't offer a platitude. She grabbed the lapels of his $10,000 suit, pulling his face down to hers to silence the warnings he was trying to articulate. The kiss was a hungry, unrestrained collision, a red dangerous pact that tasted of salt and desperation, marking the exact moment Diane Johnson's old life was incinerated. As Ku Jae-hwan's hands tangled in her hair, Diane Johnson felt the cold weight of the handgun holstered at his side, a physical manifestation of the war she was now enlisting in. She realized that by letting him in, she was inviting every ghost of his father's past and every rival of his present to her dinner table. Ku Jae-hwan pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his voice a low, terrifying vow. "There is no going back from this, Diane Johnson. You are mine now, and that makes you the primary target for every man who wants my head." Diane Johnson didn't flinch, her gaze locking onto his as she felt the first vibration of a phone that wasn't hers, a burner in Ku Jae-hwan's pocket that only rang when blood was about to be spilled. The vibration of the burner phone in Ku Jae-hwan's pocket was still echoing when the first black SUV jumped the curb, blocking Diane Johnson's path to the First National Bank entrance. Diane Johnson barely had time to register the scent of burning rubber before two men in tactical masks lunged from the sliding doors, their movements a practiced, military-grade efficiency. Diane Johnson felt the sharp, cold bite of a sedative needle against her neck, the world tilting into a kaleidoscope of grey concrete and screaming tires. As the heavy door slammed shut, Diane Johnson's last conscious thought wasn't of her own survival, but of the $250,000 deposit slip still tucked in her vest, a paper trail that now felt like a death warrant. When the darkness finally splintered, Diane Johnson found herself zip-tied to a rusted chair in a warehouse that smelled of stagnant river water and diesel. Mansu stood before her, his silk suit a jarring contrast to the filth of the Southside docks, his fingers tracing a jagged scar on his own jaw as he studied Diane Johnson like a line item on a hostile takeover. Ku Jae-hwan has spent 30 years building a fortress around his heart, yet he left the front gate wide open for a bank teller. Mansu sneered, his voice a low, oily rasp that made the hair on Diane Johnson's arms stand. Mansu leaned in, the metallic scent of his cologne clashing with the bitter taste of copper in Diane Johnson's mouth. "You aren't a person to me, Diane Johnson. You are simply the Northside territory Ku Jae-hwan is about to sign over to keep you breathing." Diane Johnson didn't scream. She used her bank-trained sixth sense to count the exits and the weapons, noting the way Mansu's men stood with an amateurish aggression that signaled a lack of true discipline. Mansu expected a breakdown, a plea for mercy that would satisfy his need to humiliate the woman Ku Jae-hwan had chosen, but Diane Johnson met his gaze with a terrifying, professional stillness. "You think this is about land, but your books are leaking, Mansu," Diane Johnson countered, her voice cracking but sharp enough to draw blood. Mansu's smirk faltered for a microsecond, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as Diane Johnson targeted the one thing men like him feared more than death: financial ruin. Diane Johnson realized in that moment that Mansu wasn't just a rival. He was a gambler playing with stolen chips, and he was deeper in debt than Ku Jae-hwan ever imagined. As the drive to the secondary location began, Diane Johnson felt the rough vibration of the van's floorboard against her bound ankles, her mind spinning through the offshore LLC structures she had studied for her degree. She began mentally drafting a shell game of wire transfers and federal reporting triggers that could incinerate Mansu's hidden assets before he even touched a pen to a contract. Diane Johnson looked out the tinted window at the passing city lights, realizing that she was no longer the leverage in this war. She was a silent assassin in a pinstriped vest. But as the van slowed to a crawl, Diane Johnson saw the reflection of a familiar high-performance engine in the side mirror, and she realized Ku Jae-hwan had arrived, not with a surrender, but with a scorched earth fury that might kill them both. The metallic scent of blood and rusted iron hung heavy in the warehouse as Diane Johnson watched the men throw Ku Jae-hwan onto the concrete. Ku Jae-hwan's face was a map of split skin and dark bruising, his hands zip-tied behind his back, yet his eyes remained fixed on Diane Johnson with a devastating, silent apology. Mansu stood over him, a heavy fountain pen in one hand and a property transfer deed in the other, his shadow stretching across the floor like a shroud. "One signature, Jae-hwan, and the girl walks," Mansu provoked, the pen hovering over the document that would dismantle 30 years of the coup legacy. Ku Jae-hwan's breath came in ragged, wet hitches, his head bowing as he prepared to surrender the only shield he had left to save the woman he loved. "Don't you dare sign that, Ku Jae-hwan," Diane Johnson's voice cut through the damp silence, a sharp, administrative command that froze the room. Diane Johnson ignored the stinging sweat in her eyes, leaning forward against her own restraints as she addressed the man who was ready to bankrupt his soul for her. She knew that if Ku Jae-hwan surrendered his territory, he wouldn't just be losing buildings, he would be losing the protection that kept Mangy alive. Diane Johnson saw the flicker of the same little boy who had watched his father die, desperate to stop the cycle of loss by repeating the sacrifice. But Diane Johnson wasn't a victim to be bought. She was a senior teller who knew exactly how much Mansu's empire was actually worth. Diane Johnson turned her gaze to Mansu, her eyes narrowing as she mentally audited the man standing before her. "You're over-leveraged, Mansu, and that Northside territory won't save you from the federal audit I'm going to trigger the moment I'm free," Diane Johnson stated, her voice devoid of a single tremor. Mansu's laugh died in his throat as Diane Johnson detailed 3 specific offshore accounts and a shell company in the Cayman Islands that she had flagged during her late-night research at the bank. She warned Mansu that killing a bank official with her level of security clearance would bring a spotlight onto his books that no amount of bloodshed could extinguish. Mansu's knuckles turned white around the pen, the realization dawning that Diane Johnson was a more lethal weapon than the gunmen surrounding her. Mansu signaled his men to cut the ties, the retreat in his eyes a temporary win that felt like a cold, hollow victory. "Take her and go, Jae Hwan, before I decide the audit is worth the execution," Mansu hissed, his voice a low promise of future wreckage. Koo Jae Hwan stumbled to his feet, his hands trembling as he guided Diane Johnson toward the exit, but the warmth of their earlier reunion was gone, replaced by a wall of jagged, icy silence. As the cool night air hit them, Koo Jae Hwan didn't pull Diane Johnson into an embrace. He shoved her toward his car with a frantic, desperate distance. Koo Jae Hwan looked at her through a mask of blood and trauma, his voice a hollow shell of the man who had kissed her at 1 a.m. "I cannot do this again, Diane Johnson. I'm taking you home, and I'm never coming back." The sterile, clinical scent of Chicago Memorial Hospital clung to Diane Johnson's skin as Mangy gripped her arm with a strength that belied the older woman's frail frame. Mangy's eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them papery and gray, reflecting the same terror Diane Johnson had seen in Koo Jae Hwan after the warehouse. "He is burying himself alive to keep you out of the dirt, Diane Johnson," Mangy whispered, her voice a dry rattle that echoed the grief of a woman who had already lost one man to the shadow world. Mangy begged her to intervene before Koo Jae Hwan's protection became a permanent tomb of isolation. Diane Johnson felt the stinging heat of tears she refused to shed, her pulse thrumming with the realization that Koo Jae Hwan was repeating his father's tragic mistake, believing that love meant living in a vacuum. Diane Johnson pushed through the heavy door of room 304, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor the only sound in the dim light. Koo Jae Hwan sat in the corner, a dark silhouette against the city lights, his hands bandaged and his jaw set in a line of jagged glass. He didn't look up as Diane Johnson entered, his silence a weapon designed to drive her back into the safety of her ordinary life. "The car is waiting downstairs to take you home, Diane Johnson. Don't make me call security to remove you," Koo Jae Hwan rasped, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once promised her a future. The win was a hollow one. He was safe, but the cost was the incineration of every bridge they had built. Koo Jae Hwan stood, his towering frame casting a long, predatory shadow over Diane Johnson, his eyes cold and hollow like a shuttered building. "My life is not a romance. It is a ledger of constant vigilance and imminent threats," Koo Jae Hwan growled, attempting to walk past her with the same boss authority he used on the street. Diane Johnson didn't move an inch. Instead, she slammed her palm against his chest, her finger poking into the expensive silk of his shirt with the force of an indictment. "You don't get to decide what risks I can handle, Koo Jae Hwan," Diane Johnson declared, her voice cracking but vibrating with a power that made the heart monitor skip a beat. She saw the flicker of the boy who watched his father die, desperately trying to control the uncontrollable by abandoning the only thing that made him human. Diane Johnson stepped into his personal space, her knuckles white as she grabbed his collar, forcing Koo Jae Hwan to look at the fire he was trying to extinguish. "I am choosing the dangerous parts and the gentle parts, because a life of safe abandonment isn't a life at all," Diane Johnson hissed, her breath ghosting over his bruised lips. She demanded a partnership, not a pedestal, challenging him to be brave enough to be vulnerable in the face of his enemies. Koo Jae Hwan's wall of icy distance finally splintered, his forehead dropping onto hers as he let out a jagged, broken breath that sounded like a surrender. But as his arms finally closed around her, the door to the room swung open, and the lead security detail stood there with a face as pale as the hospital sheets. Diane Johnson stared at the golden Chicago skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, the once sterile marble floors now softened by the vibrant patterns of her South Side rugs. 3 months had transformed Koo Jae Hwan's glass fortress into a living breathing contradiction where high-end security tech hummed beneath the scent of Diane Johnson's home-cooked breakfast. Koo Jae Hwan stood by the kitchen island, his bandaged hands from the hospital now healed but his eyes still performing that habitual, lethal sweep of the perimeter. Diane Johnson adjusted her blazer, the weight of her new assistant manager badge a badge of honor that felt strangely heavy against the reality of the 2 black SUVs waiting in the basement to shadow her commute. She had won her career back, but the price of admission was a life where every sunrise felt like a tactical victory. "The L train is faster than your motorcade, Koo Jae Hwan, and I'm already late for the morning vault audit," Diane Johnson stated, her voice a sharp, familiar strike that no longer sought to wound, but to ground him. Koo Jae Hwan didn't turn from the window, his jaw tightening as he watched a generic delivery van idle too long at the curb below. "The L train is a target-rich environment where I cannot control the variables," Diane Johnson, Ku Jae-hwan countered, the words a defensive shield he refused to lower even in the warmth of their shared kitchen. He was no longer the monster she'd ordered to take a seat, but the ghost of his father's assassination still dictated the rhythm of his breathing. Diane Johnson stepped into his space, her hand resting on the dragon tattoo at his neck, feeling the jagged pulse of a man who still slept with one eye on the door. Ku Jae-hwan finally relented, his forehead dropping against Diane Johnson's with a jagged sigh that signaled a temporary truce in their ongoing war of wills. He reached for his coffee, the simple act of a Sunday morning routine feeling like the most dangerous thing they had ever dared to keep. Mangy is coming for lunch, and she expects you to have mastered the tteokbokki recipe, or I'll never hear the end of it, Ku Jae-hwan murmured, his voice finally losing its metallic edge. Diane Johnson laughed, a sound that felt like a subversion of the dark world pressing against their windows, but the moment was punctured by the low, insistent buzz of a burner phone on the counter. Ku Jae-hwan didn't answer it, his fingers interlacing with Diane Johnson's as they stood in the fragile light of a dangerous ordinary life. The city woke up in shades of golden grey, a landscape where Mansu's remnants still plotted in the shadows and Diane Johnson's bank ledger remained a target for those who knew her secret. There were two people who had found a way to bridge impossible divides, cultural, moral, and lethal, finding a precious, terrifying happiness in the center of the storm. Diane Johnson looked at the phone, then at the man who had traded his throne for a partnership, realizing that their love wasn't a sanctuary, but a battlefield they chose to occupy together. Are you ready for another day of being hunted? Diane Johnson asked, her voice cracking with the weight of the risk. Ku Jae-hwan pulled her closer, his eyes finally finding peace in hers. As long as you're the one holding the leash, Diane Johnson, I'll fight the whole world.